It was built in the land of freedom, but it drove like a death trap. Some exploded, others couldn't stop. A few fell apart right on the road. These weren't just bad cars, they were national embarrassments. And the worst part? Millions of Americans own them. These are 12 dangerous disasters you won't believe were ever real, and one of them truly disgraced American engineering. 1. Plymouth Fury, 1956 to 1959. The 1956 and 1959 Plymouth Fury was Detroit's chrome-fin siren song of speed, style, and tragically, complete disregard for basic human survivability. Long before Stephen King gave it a supernatural streak of violence in Christine, the Fury was already a terrifying machine in its own right, not because it was possessed, but because it was built at a time when safety simply wasn't a consideration. When Plymouth introduced the Fury in 1956 as a limited edition performance model, it was meant to be a halo car, a muscular, high-powered showcase of what Chrysler's divisions could do. It featured a big V8 engine, lightweight construction, and stylish two-tone paint with gold anodized trim. It was fast, flashy, and surprisingly agile for a full-size American car of the era. Buyers were thrilled, but beneath the tail fins and horsepower lay a lethal combination of poor crash protection and structural neglect. One of the most striking dangers of the early Fury was its unibody construction. While unibody design would later become a standard in modern automotive engineering, Plymouth's early attempt lacked the internal reinforcement needed to offer any real protection in a collision. Unlike body-on-frame cars of the time, which could at least absorb some crash force through frame deformation, the Fury's thin-gauge steel structure offered no such mercy. In a frontal impact, the crumple zones were effectively non-existent. The front end might have absorbed some damage, but the force often translated directly into the cabin. And then came the steering shaft, the infamous metal spear. The long, solid steel shaft that connected the steering wheel to the front wheels had no collapsible mechanism. It was a direct path from the firewall to the driver's ribcage. In a head-on collision, it wasn't uncommon for the shaft to drive back through the firewall like a javelin, impaling or crushing the driver. This wasn't a bug, it was standard design of the day. But in a car as fast and unwieldy as the Fury, the risks were magnified. Once you floored it, it went wherever it wanted, not where you did, one mechanic remembered. With power approaching 300 horsepower and brakes that barely kept up with family sedans, the Fury could get out of control in a heartbeat. Worse, its famously tall rear fins, a design flourished from the Virgil Exner school of styling excess, caught crosswinds like sails. On highways or in sudden gusts, the rear end could get light and twitchy, unsettling the car at the worst possible moment. The steering was often vague, especially at higher speeds, giving the impression of being along for the ride rather than in control of it. Despite its good looks and thrilling acceleration, the Fury was not a car for the faint of heart. Its interior was filled with hazards that turned a crash into a horror show. Sharp dash edges, brittle plastic knobs, protruding switchgear, all mounted into an iron dashboard that didn't budge under force. There were no seat belts, no headrests, no door reinforcements. If you hit something, your body took the full force, or worse, became a pinball bouncing off the inside of a steel death chamber. One of the most overlooked dangers of the Fury was its weight distribution. With a heavy V8 up front and relatively little weight over the rear wheels, traction under acceleration could be poor, especially on wet or loose surfaces. This often led to spinouts or fishtailing when enthusiastic drivers put their foot down. Combine this with numb steering, weak drum brakes, and unpredictable suspension geometry, and you had a car that could get into trouble fast and offered no help getting out of it. And yet, the Fury sold well. It was desirable, it had swagger, and it looked like the future. Buyers were drawn to its space-age styling, rakish roofline, and pavement-scorching performance. But what they didn't realize was that they were buying a weapon disguised as a weekend cruiser. There's a reason so many early Furies ended up in junkyards with crushed front ends and twisted passenger compartments. They simply weren't built to survive the kind of speed they offered. Today, the 1956-1959 Plymouth Fury is remembered fondly by collectors and nostalgists for its beauty and performance. It's a shining example of 1950s optimism wrapped in a chrome-plated fantasy. But among safety historians, it's also an example of how American car makers prioritized appearance and acceleration over occupant protection. Before collapsible steering columns, before reinforced door beams, before the seatbelt became standard, there were cars like the Fury, gorgeous, thrilling, and as deadly as they were desirable. It wasn't just Christine. The Fury didn't need a demonic spirit to be dangerous. It came that way from the factory. 2. Hudson Jet, 1953 to 1954. The 1953 to 1954 Hudson Jet was a car born out of desperation, a compact gamble from a company best known for sweeping NASCAR with sleek, low-slung sedans. In its final years, Hudson needed a hit to stay alive, and management, against the advice of many engineers, bet the farm on the Jet. What they created was neither fast nor safe, and far from competitive. In fact, the Jet was a tragic example of how cutting corners under financial strain can lead to both engineering failure and commercial doom. On paper, the Jet was supposed to be a sensible compact, a small, efficient car with economy-minded buyers in mind. But Hudson, despite its racing pedigree with the famed Hornet, was woefully unprepared to produce a small car. Their assembly lines, engineering teams, and corporate mindset were all tuned to build big, heavy, rear-drive cruisers with robust chassis and inline sixes that could survive the rigors of stock car racing. When they downsized the blueprint to create the Jet, everything that had made Hudson's reliable and roadworthy seemed to evaporate. One of the worst offenders was the frame itself. The Jet used a perimeter-type frame that was stamped from thinner steel than its full-size siblings, and it showed. After just a couple of seasons in northern climates, the Jet's undercarriage would start to rust. Not superficially, but structurally. Rust spread rapidly through the frame rails and floor pans. The car's integrity didn't just suffer in crashes, it degraded while parked. In several cases, reported even at the time, suspension mounting points rusted completely through, causing the front end to sag or collapse outright. Worse still, early road tests noted vibration and flex in the chassis under normal driving conditions. Then there was the handling, or rather, the lack of it. The Jet had a short 105-inch wheelbase and relatively narrow track width, which might have helped it feel nimble, but only on smooth, straight roads. In corners, the suspension geometry was both crude and easily overwhelmed. The coil springs weren't up to the bait of managing body roll, and rear leaf springs were prone to fatigue. Many owners reported that after just a few years, or sometimes even months, their Jets sagged in the rear. As one owner grimly recalled, "I lost a rear spring at 40 mph. It just fell out." That wasn't hyperbole. The rear shackles would rust, loosen, and snap. Once the suspension gave out, it wasn't a safe recovery. The Jet's tail could squat into the tires or drag on the pavement. And while the Jet looked tidy and stubby, that short wheelbase created an unexpected hazard at higher speeds. The car became twitchy, especially on highways or uneven surfaces. Crosswinds had a nasty habit of nudging the car offline, and because of vague steering with considerable play, making course corrections could feel like guesswork. At 50-60 mph, the Jet's nervousness became unnerving, and high-speed stability was nearly non-existent. The safety situation inside the car didn't inspire much confidence either. Like most early 1950s vehicles, there were no seatbelts, no padded dashboards, and very few concessions to crash survivability. The interior was bare bones and budget built, with exposed steel, hard plastics, and low-quality upholstery. In a collision, passengers faced a metal steering column aimed at their chests, sharp dashboard corners, and breakable glass knobs. The dashboard itself was little more than a steel slab, unyielding and ready to shatter kneecaps. Structurally, the Jet also suffered from weak door latches and thin side panels. In side-impact collisions, the door skins crumpled easily, and in many cases, doors popped open on impact, risking passenger ejection. Add to that minimal roof strength, which could pancake in a rollover, and the Jet offered little meaningful protection. The mechanical components didn't help the car's reputation either. The engine, a flathead inline-six, was underpowered and unrefined, offering sluggish acceleration and an agricultural soundtrack. Worse, Hudson's marketing tried to present the Jet as a premium compact, which meant it cost more than similarly sized and far better engineered offerings from Chevrolet and Ford. Buyers were puzzled. Why pay more for a smaller, worse-handling car that was already outdated the moment it left the factory? 3. Studebaker Commander, 1947 to 1952. The 1947 to 1952 Studebaker Commander was one of the most visually radical post-war American cars, low-slung, futuristic, and distinctively styled with that unmistakable coming or going bullet nose in the front. Designed under Raymond Loewy's influence, the car made a bold aesthetic statement, and it helped cement Studebaker's reputation for daring to be different. But underneath the flair and fashion-forward sheet metal lurked a host of engineering shortcuts, safety compromises, and mechanical issues that made the Commander far more dangerous than it ever looked. These Commanders were built in an era when style often took priority over substance, and this car exemplified that ethos. It was built on aging pre-war chassis designs, and though it appeared sleek, the platform underneath hadn't evolved enough to match the demands of post-war American roads. The suspension was a particular weak point. Up front, the coil springs and lever-action shock absorbers struggled to manage the car's nose-heavy weight distribution. On rough pavement, the front end would pogo like a worn-out carnival ride. Drivers frequently described the handling as floaty, disconnected, or just plain bouncy. Rear leaf springs didn't help. They were tuned for softness, not control, and could bottom out under moderate loads or heavy braking. And braking was where things got even scarier. Like many cars of the time, the Commander relied on drum brakes at all four corners. But in this case, they were particularly undersized for the car's weight. Brake fade wasn't just a possibility, it was an expectation. After one or two firm stops from highway speeds, stopping distances would increase dramatically. Owners in hilly areas often reported that descending steep grades felt more like an act of faith than a function of engineering. There were no dual circuit systems, no power assist on lower trims, and absolutely no backup if the drums got hot, except downshifting and prayer. Perhaps the most notorious and genuinely dangerous flaw, however, was the hood mechanism. The long, heavy hood, especially on the 1950-1951 models, was held in place by thin steel latches that weakened over time. If a latch was misaligned, rusted, or simply not fully engaged, the wind at speed could rip the hood upward with terrifying results. One former owner recalled, "It blinded me on the freeway. The whole hood shot up and bent over the roof." That wasn't just hyperbole. Numerous accounts from period drivers report hoods slamming open at highway speeds, slamming into the windshield, or flipping over the cab entirely, obliterating visibility and often buckling the roof sheet metal in the process. Even worse, the sudden force would sometimes rip the hinges loose, turning the hood into a dangerously flapping sail of steel. Imagine a 75-pound metal panel yanked skyward at 65 mph, and then imagine trying to steer through that. Inside, the Commander wasn't exactly a haven of protection either. The cabin was trimmed in post-war fashion, hard plastics, steel dashboards, and large knobs positioned right where your knees and elbows would swing in a collision. There were no seat belts, not even as options, and the doors could pop open under impact due to basic latching mechanisms. Side impact strength was minimal. Studebaker's commitment to innovation didn't quite extend to safety, and while it may have looked like a car from the future, it offered none of the crash survivability that the future would eventually demand. Handling in adverse conditions was equally problematic. The car's weight distribution skewed forward, and on wet roads the rear end could step out with little warning, and the slow, non-rack and pinion steering gave drivers little chance to recover. Add in bias ply tires with tiny contact patches, and it was a recipe for dramatic slides in roadside spinouts. Snow and ice? Forget it. Studebaker might as well have included a shovel in the trunk. Despite these issues, the Commander sold relatively well in its time, thanks to its stunning looks and post-war patriotic appeal. It offered more character than a Ford or Chevrolet, and for buyers seeking to stand out in suburban driveways, the swoopy Studebaker did just that. But behind the style was a platform not ready for modern speeds or modern driving conditions. It was a car for looking good in, not for surviving in. Today, early post-war Studebaker Commanders are prized by collectors for their design, but their mechanical shortcomings and structural dangers are well documented. Restorers often reinforce the hoods with aftermarket latches, retrofit modern brakes, and swap out the soft suspension components just to make them roadworthy. They know what history has proven. The Commander's beauty was more than skin deep, but so was its potential to kill. In the end, the 1947-1952 Commander was a car that looked ahead while driving on borrowed time. 4. Ford Custom Line, 1952 to 1956. The 1952-1956 Ford Custom Line may not be remembered today as a glamorous icon or muscle-bound powerhouse, but in its time, it was one of Ford's most ubiquitous workhorses, a stalwart of American roads, beloved by fleet buyers, police departments, and blue-collar families alike. It was practical, affordable, and, in many ways, rugged. But that same no-nonsense simplicity masked a terrifying lack of safety engineering. Beneath its familiar post-war silhouette lay a vehicle that, in a crash, offered about as much protection as a folding chair on skates. Built in an era when safety was still considered an inconvenience, or even a sales deterrent, the Custom Line was assembled using then-standard body-on-frame architecture and the most basic interior materials imaginable. Its sturdy steel construction was more about resisting rust than protecting passengers, and it followed Detroit's post-war formula. Flat bench seats, hard plastic knobs, and a giant two-spoke steering wheel aimed squarely at your chest. No seatbelts, no crumple zones, no padding. If the car hit something, the force of impact went directly into your body, and in many cases, through it. The flat bench seats were a particular hazard, especially in side or offset frontal collisions. Designed more for comfort and cost-cutting than safety, these seats offered zero lateral support. Passengers, even restrained by the steering wheel or dashboard, which was often the only thing stopping them from flying forward, could be hurled sideways across the cabin like bowling pins. In one real-world crash account from 1954, a family of 4 in a Custom Line T-boned a truck at an intersection. All 4 occupants struck different parts of the interior, and the rear seat child was thrown forward, striking the metal ashtray with his head. There were no airbags. There were no restraints. There were just hard surfaces in the hope that inertia might be kind. The door locks were another ticking time bomb. Designed with simple mechanical mechanisms and lacking any modern reinforcing latches or intrusion beams, the doors could, and frequently did, burst open even in low-speed collisions. In rollover scenarios, ejection was common. In side impacts, doors could crumple inward like foil, leaving occupants exposed to crushing forces. It was not unusual for EMTs to arrive at the scene of a Custom Line crash and find passengers partially or completely ejected, even in otherwise survivable crashes by today's standards. And then there was the steering column, the Custom Line's most infamous feature and one of the most lethal. The long, spear-like shaft that connected the steering wheel to the gearbox extended directly from the firewall to the driver's chest, with no collapsible mechanism and no deflection design. In a frontal collision, especially at moderate to high speed, the steering wheel would act as a battering ram. There are countless horror stories of drivers impaled by the column or suffering massive internal injuries from the column being forced into their ribcage. One particularly grim anecdote came from a retired Nebraska police officer who investigated a Custom Line crash in 1955. When we wrecked, there was blood on the dash and teeth in the glove box. It wasn't just colorful language, it was reality. Broken jaws, shattered faces, and punctured lungs were all too common injuries in Custom Line wrecks. Even the dashboard, a gleaming expanse of chrome, steel, and hard plastic, was a menace. The design prioritized aesthetics over impact absorption. Knobs, switches, and radio buttons were often hard-edged and pointed, acting like blunt weapons during an accident. Gauges were sometimes recessed into the dash with metal bezels that could slice skin on contact. There was no padding of any kind. It wasn't just that the car lacked modern safety equipment, it actively presented its own form of interior weaponry. Braking performance was another critical flaw. Though later models upgraded to larger drum brakes, the custom line never offered power assist or disc options during its production run. Stopping distances were long, and fade was a real threat, especially on hilly roads or in stop-and-go city traffic. More than one driver reported the terrifying experience of pushing the brake pedal only to feel the resistance go soft, leaving only engine braking and prayers to slow the car down. Combine this with cross-ply tires, narrow contact patches, and poor weight distribution, and you had a car that didn't just crash, it aimed you at the crash. Yet the custom line was everywhere. Its reputation for basic reliability, combined with its low cost and wide availability, made it a common sight from coast to coast. Police departments liked its simplicity, families liked its price, but very few understood that this affordable car came with a hidden cost. One paid in blood and bone when things went wrong. 5. Chevrolet Style Line, 1959 to 1952. The 1905 to 1952 Chevrolet Style Line represented a fresh post-war face for General Motors, a car meant to usher in prosperity, pride, and progress for the average American family. It was big for its class, clean in design, and widely considered a handsome evolution from the pre-war cars it replaced. But for all its visual charm and showroom appeal, the Style Line was a death trap in disguise, a masterclass in how to make something look inviting while hiding the brutal truth of its design. This was an era when safety wasn't just an afterthought, it was actively ignored. The Style Line, like most cars of its time, was built for style and speed, not survival. Its architecture was based on the prevailing body-on-frame setup, with minimal attention paid to crumple zones or structural deformation. The rigid ladder frame underneath gave the car strength, but not for crash absorption. In a collision, it transmitted energy directly to the passenger cabin, turning every hard surface inside into a potential bludgeon. The dashboard of the Style Line was especially notorious. A massive steel slab stretching from door to door, it was a polished, painted expanse of doom. Trimmed with bright chrome metal knobs and toggle switches that jutted out like switchblades, it was designed to dazzle the eye, and unfortunately split the skull. There was no padding, no breakaway steering column, no recessed controls. It was as though the designers imagined the interior less as a protective cocoon and more as a test of survival. Even at modest speeds, say a 25 or 30 urban collision, the results were often catastrophic. If a driver or passenger wasn't restrained, and remember, seatbelts were not available at all in these models, they were launched headfirst into the metal dash, or, worse, through the thin, brittle windshield glass. Unlike modern laminated safety glass, the Style Line's windshields could shatter into lethal shards on impact, turning the windshield frame into a kind of guillotine. Countless emergency room visits began with forehead gashes, fractured jaws, or missing teeth from direct impact with the dash or upper windshield molding. One chilling first-hand account comes from a now-retired mechanic in Ohio. "My cousin hit a mailbox. The dash broke his face like a brick wall." He wasn't exaggerating. Even glancing blows could result in broken noses, cracked orbital bones, or deep facial lacerations. The design left zero room for forgiveness. There were no airbags. There were no crumple zones. There was just cold, stamped steel, and a hope you didn't hit anything harder than yourself. The steering column was equally dangerous. Rigid and uncollapsible, it was mounted close to the driver's torso and was known to drive backward into the chest in front-end collisions. In crashes involving trees or stationary obstacles, it wasn't uncommon for the wheel to compress into the driver's ribs or sternum, causing internal injuries or worse. The horn button, center cap, and steering wheel ring, all made of metal, added insult to injury. They didn't just fail to protect, they actively hurt. Beyond the front cabin, the rear seating offered little comfort and no protection. The bench was winnan and slick, ideal for sliding across during any kind of evasive maneuver or sudden stop. Kids bounced freely in the back with nothing but parental hope to hold them in place. In a rear-end collision, passengers often hit the front seat back with the full force of their body weight, causing back injuries or bruised knees. The seat backs themselves were thinly padded and mounted with rigid metal brackets, adding to the cascade of hazards. And let's not forget the door design. In moderate impacts, especially side collisions, the doors had a tendency to pop open or buckle inward. There were no side impact beams or reinforcing rails. The latches were simple mechanical affairs, easily defeated by crash forces. In winter Rust Belt states, door rot was common after just a few years, further weakening the structure. A side crash on a slippery road didn't just mean a bent frame. It often meant someone being ejected entirely. The irony, of course, was that Chevrolet marketed the style line as a family car. Dependable, comfortable, and safe by implication. Ads showed smiling families heading to church, picnics, or the city. But behind those ads was a reality of design complacency, the idea that performance and comfort could coexist with neglect toward occupants' survival. Safety simply wasn't profitable, and the public wasn't asking for it. Collectors today may praise the style line for its historical value, its grille design, or its place in post-war Americana. But the sobering truth is that it was a rolling metal shell with the manners of a mob enforcer. There was nothing soft about it. Not in a crash, not in an emergency, not when your cousin's face met the dashboard like a wrecking ball. 6. Mercury Monterey, 1950-1954. The 1950 and 1954 Mercury Monterey was Ford's attempt to offer a mid-tier luxury cruiser, a car positioned between the no-nonsense Ford Custom line and the more decadent Lincoln Cosmopolitan. With its chrome-heavy trim, rakish rooflines, and plush interiors, the Monterey was intended to deliver comfort and prestige to post-war buyers. And on the surface, it did just that. But underneath all the shiny optimism and V8 bravado lurked a vehicle so fundamentally flawed in its safety design that even mild accidents could result in carnage. The problem wasn't just one thing, it was everything. The Monterey was an early product of America's horsepower race. Mercury's flathead V8s and, later, overhead valve engines offered strong low-end torque and effortless cruising speed. But the rest of the car, the frame, suspension, brakes, and tires, simply couldn't keep up. The result was a car that could outrun its own ability to stop or corner safely. In corners, the Monterey leaned like a ship in a squall. This wasn't just a matter of driver confidence, it was structural. The car sat on a ladder frame with soft coil springs and minimal lateral support. At moderate speeds, the body roll was extreme enough to unsettle passengers, and in emergency maneuvers, it could lead to the car swaying uncontrollably. Stories abounded of drivers misjudging off-ramps or rural curves and ending up in ditches, not because of reckless speed, but because the car's suspension geometry simply gave up. Braking was an equally grim affair. Like most cars of its era, the Monterey relied on four-wheel drum brakes, which were marginally adequate at best and dangerous at worst. In stop-and-go city traffic, they overheated easily. On steep descents or during panic stops, they faded to near uselessness. One terrified owner once described a high-speed descent in the Appalachians. By the time I hit the bottom, I was riding the emergency brake and praying. That wasn't hyperbole. That was the reality of a car with 3,800 pounds of mass and no power assist for brakes. Then there was the interior, a gleaming shrine to mid-century optimism and a chamber of horrors in a collision. The dashboard was entirely made of painted steel, interrupted only by chrome-plated switches, toggle levers, and accessories. Every knob was a projectile in waiting. Mercury touted the interior as driver-centric, but in reality it was a pincushion of potential injury points. During even low-speed crashes, unsecured items could break free, ricochet off panels, or embed themselves in upholstery or passengers. One chilling anecdote from an Arkansas body man illustrates the danger. A fender bender left the ashtray lodged in the back seat. That was no joke. Many early Montereys had dash-mounted pull-out ashtrays made from thick cast metal. In a crash, they could eject with the force of a fastball. Likewise, cigarette lighters, glove box doors, and radio knobs routinely came loose and caused injuries. The steering wheel itself, a large, thin-rimmed metal cord circle, was mounted on a solid, non-collapsible shaft aimed directly at the driver's sternum. In front-end collisions, it often turned the wheel into a spear. Side impact protection was equally dismal. Door frames had no internal reinforcements. In fact, the inner structure of the doors was often a single sheet of stamped steel. Any significant side hit caused the door to cave inward like a soda can, crushing the occupants' hips or torsos. And because seatbelts were not yet standard, nor even an option, occupants had nothing holding them back from being ejected or thrown forward. Weather also played a role in the car's unpredictability. The early Montereys had relatively narrow tires by modern standards, with limited grip. On wet roads, they hydroplaned easily. On ice or snow, rear-wheel drive and poor weight distribution made them tail-happy and prone to spinouts. With no traction control or anti-lock braking systems, decades away, a panic stop in winter could quickly become a fishtailing disaster. The sad irony is that the Monterey's danger came not from mechanical unreliability. It was actually a decently built car by 1950s standards, but from the very things it lacked: safety engineering, thoughtful ergonomics, and restraint systems. It wasn't alone in this. Nearly all cars of the time were woefully unsafe, but the Monterey stands out because of how thoroughly it mixed power and weight with soft handling and sharp metal interiors, a recipe for disaster. Collectors today may admire the Monterey's streamlined fenders, bullet-nose grille, and mid-century charm. But under that glitz lies a car that offered almost no forgiveness when things went wrong. It was a luxury cruiser on the showroom floor and a rolling liability on the street. In the end, the Monterey was a perfect emblem of the era's misguided priorities: chrome over caution, speed over safety. 7. Dodge Meadowbrook, 1940-1954. The 1940-1954 Dodge Meadowbrook was supposed to be the solid, dependable choice in Dodge's post-war lineup, a no-nonsense, middle-of-the-road sedan built for working-class Americans who didn't need fins, flash, or frills. And from a distance, it did appear trustworthy. A modest, slab-sided family car with a reliable flathead 6, basic column-shift transmission, and a reputation for simplicity. But beneath that square-jawed, sensible exterior lurked mechanical shortcomings that made the Meadowbrook one of the more quietly hazardous American sedans of its time. To begin with, the front suspension was a ticking time bomb. The Meadowbrook's control arms, the vital components that held the front wheels in place and absorbed cornering loads, were known to fail catastrophically under stress. Weak welds, subpar metallurgy, and poor quality control meant that some Meadowbrooks left the factory with components that could crack or even shear entirely during spirited cornering or after hitting a pothole at speed. In many documented cases, the lower control arms or kingpins would fracture mid-drive, sending the front wheels folding inward and the car collapsing to the pavement. Combine that with the kingpin-style front suspension, already a dated technology by the 1950s, and you had a steering system that felt loose, disconnected, and slow to respond. Many owners complained about the dead zone in the steering wheel, an alarming degree of slack where you could turn the wheel several inches with no response at the front wheels. At highway speeds, this wasn't just annoying, it was terrifying. You couldn't steer it, you just tried to aim, said a retired delivery driver from Pennsylvania, who put more than 80,000 miles on a company-issued 1952 Meadowbrook. If you hit a patch of wet leaves or loose gravel, forget it. The car picked a direction and you just hoped it was the same one you were going. Part of the problem was also due to the tires. Like many cars of the early 50s, the Meadowbrook rode on narrow, high-profile bias-ply tires that had little grip in wet conditions and poor cornering stability. But the Dodge was heavier than many of its contemporaries, thanks in part to a tall ride height and a thick steel body, which only made things worse. When the tires began to slide, the rest of the car didn't follow gracefully. It plowed ahead in understeer or snapped into a rear-wheel skid with little warning. Weight distribution didn't help either. With most of the mass concentrated over the front axle and a relatively light rear, the Meadowbrook had a tendency to nosedive under braking and fishtail under throttle. It wasn't unusual for inexperienced drivers to lose control on winding roads, especially in rainy or icy conditions. And remember, this was before seatbelts were standard. A spin-out or front-end crash meant flinging the driver into the steering wheel, dashboard, or even through the windshield. Speaking of dashboards, the interior of the Meadowbrook was hardly safer than the mechanicals. The dash was made of rigid stamped steel and adorned with large chrome-plated knobs, toggle switches, and ashtrays that became dangerous projectiles in a crash. The steering wheel was mounted on a solid, unforgiving column, a brutal weapon in a frontal collision. As with most cars of its era, the Meadowbrook had no padding, no seatbelts, no crumple zones, and no side impact reinforcement. What it did have was a lot of hard metal and sharp corners inside the cabin. Durability was advertised, and to be fair, the engine and transmission often lived up to the promise. The Flathead 6 was dependable and could take abuse, and the PowerFlight automatic transmission, available from 1953 onward, was smooth if sluggish. But all that meant little when the car couldn't handle emergency maneuvers or sustain cornering forces without disintegrating at the front end. Rust also played its part in shortening the Meadowbrook's service life. Though better than some of its rivals, the body was not well sealed, and many Meadowbrooks in northern climates succumbed to frame rot and floor pan corrosion within 5 or 6 winters. That further weakened the structural rigidity of a car already vulnerable to twisting and flexing during hard use. What's perhaps most damning is how quietly the Meadowbrook's flaws were accepted. It never became infamous like the Corvair or the Pinto. It just quietly hurt people, one front-end collapse or highway drift at a time. Its dangers were pedestrian and mechanical, not dramatic or explosive, but that made them no less real. It lulled drivers into a false sense of security, the very definition of a sleeper hazard. In hindsight, the Dodge Meadowbrook stands as a perfect example of post-war complacency in American car design. It was marketed as a dependable workhorse, and for some it was, until it wasn't. Until the control arm snapped or the steering failed. 8. Packard Executive, 1956. The 1956 Packard Executive was supposed to be the flagship model that would carry the storied brand into the future. Packard, once known for its luxury and innovation, had already been struggling in the mid-50s to maintain its place in a rapidly changing automotive landscape. With a large V8 engine, attractive styling, and the promise of luxury, the Executive was intended to represent the pinnacle of Packard's expertise. Unfortunately, it was anything but the grand finale Packard had envisioned. The car was plagued with mechanical issues, some so dangerous that they would eventually contribute to the brand's decline. One of the most ambitious features of the 1956 Executive was its torsion-level suspension, a groundbreaking system designed to provide a smooth ride by using torsion bars instead of conventional springs. In theory, it should have been a marvel, providing a ride as smooth as silk with the added benefit of automatic ride height adjustment. In practice, however, the system often failed under the car's weight and the strain of regular driving. The suspension would short out, causing the car to lean violently to one side or, in some cases, bottom out mid-drive. On winding roads, this sudden loss of ride height could be disorienting and dangerous, turning what was meant to be a smooth, luxurious experience into something more akin to driving a boat through a storm. It dropped 4 inches mid-turn and scraped the pavement. "We spun twice," recounted one owner from California, who had been on a road trip with the car. The torsion-level suspension was supposed to maintain the car's height automatically, but in reality, it often malfunctioned, leaving the Executive with a lopsided, unpredictable ride. This was particularly problematic on sharp corners or during sudden maneuvers, where the car could dip or lean dangerously, threatening to send it into a skid or rollover. And then there was the massive hood, another feature that was more a curse than a blessing. The Packard Executive's hood was a stunning visual feature, long, sleek, and almost theatrical in its proportions. However, the weight of the hood was far too much for the hinges to handle. On many occasions, the hood would slam shut without warning, often with frightening results. There were several reports of drivers who had to quickly pull over after their hoods dropped, causing visibility issues and potentially damaging the bodywork in the process. The sheer weight of the hood was not properly supported by the hinge design, making it a risk both on the road and in the garage. Once I had the hood fall while I was doing routine maintenance, recalled one disgruntled mechanic who had worked on several executives. It just dropped like a ton of bricks. Lucky I wasn't in front of it. This lack of proper design and attention to detail compounded the executive's list of woes. And while the car had a beautiful interior with plush leather upholstery and chrome accents, it was a luxury that couldn't mask the executive's mechanical failings. The braking system, although powerful in theory, was prone to overheating, especially in city driving or during long, hard stops. As the car grew heavier over time, the brakes couldn't keep up, leading to dangerous fade and inconsistent stopping power. "The first time I hit the brakes hard, I thought I had a flat tire," said an owner from Detroit. "Turns out it was just the brakes giving out. Felt like I was driving a tank." Without power brakes, the car's massive weight made stopping a challenge, especially when the driver needed it most. Despite these flaws, Packard continued to market the Executive as a high-end luxury car, and it attracted a certain crowd of well-heeled buyers. But the reputation of the Executive quickly spread as being a mechanical nightmare, with many owners reporting frequent breakdowns and repairs that weren't covered by warranties. The car, once a hopeful attempt at reviving Packard's fortunes, instead became an emblem of the brand's struggle, a final, desperate, and flawed attempt at relevance in a rapidly changing market. "The car was beautiful, but a disaster underneath," said a former Packard dealership manager. "It was the kind of car that made you question why you ever trusted it in the first place." In the end, the 1956 Packard Executive didn't just signal the end of an era for the brand. It was also a stark reminder of how ambitious designs, without the proper execution and reliability, can turn a dream car into a nightmare. Packard, once the epitome of American automotive luxury, would never recover from the Executive's failures. The company ceased automobile production in 1958, marking the end of an iconic brand. 9. Ford Ranchero, 1957 to 1959. The 1957 Ford Ranchero was a bold experiment, the first attempt by an American automaker to blend the functionality of a pickup truck with the styling of a car. As the first-generation model, it was a groundbreaking idea, but it also suffered from serious design flaws that would later tarnish its reputation. Ford's decision to combine a car's passenger compartment with the bed of a truck created an interesting hybrid, but the engineering left much to be desired. The Ranchero, which used the same platform as the full-size Ford sedan, wasn't designed with the rigors of truck duty in mind. This meant that the weight distribution was completely off. The rear end of the Ranchero was far too light, especially when the bed was empty, causing the vehicle to fishtail wildly, particularly in wet or slippery conditions. Owners quickly learned that the Ranchero's handling was sketchy at best, with a tendency to break loose if driven too aggressively. "The back end was all over the place when you hit the wow," said one former Ranchero owner from Texas. "It felt like it was ready to spin out at any moment." And then there was the braking system. While the Ranchero was certainly a step forward in terms of utility, it wasn't built to stop under the heavy loads that some owners expected to haul. The combination of an inadequate suspension setup and the inconsistent braking performance left the Ranchero struggling to cope with the demands of even moderate loads. When the bed was empty, stopping was less of an issue, but when loaded, especially with heavy items like a refrigerator or a stack of lumber, the brakes often felt overwhelmed. The added weight would shift in the bed, making the car-truck hybrid feel unstable during hard stops. "We loaded a fridge in the back, and it bowed like a canoe," said one owner from California, recalling an unfortunate experience that highlighted the Ranchero's structural flaws. The sheet metal bed, which Ford had designed to keep weight down and provide the truck-like utility, was another weak point. The bed itself was not braced well enough to handle the stress of heavy loads or even moderate impact. Rear-end collisions often caused the bed to buckle, sometimes to the point of folding entirely. For a vehicle touted as having truck-like capabilities, the bed simply couldn't hold up under real-world conditions, and many Rancheros had crumpled beds after even low-speed accidents. The car's construction was not tough enough to meet the demands of both a car and a truck. It was trying to be both and failing at both. "I was rear-ended in traffic once, and the whole bed just folded in," recalled a Ranchero owner from Arizona. "It was supposed to be a truck, but it couldn't take a tap from behind." Beyond the engineering failures, there was also the issue of the Ranchero's identity crisis. While it looked stylish for its time, it wasn't quite a car, nor was it a true truck. It tried to fit into both categories, but never truly succeeded in either. The 1957-1959 Ranchero had the look of a sleek sedan with the added convenience of a truck bed, but its execution was flawed in ways that would limit its appeal. Ford didn't give up on the Ranchero concept, however. The model continued to evolve throughout the 1960s and beyond, eventually becoming a beloved and functional part of Ford's lineup. The first generation, though, would always be remembered as an experiment that didn't quite hit the mark. While the Ranchero would go on to find its place as a useful, quirky part of American automotive history, its debut years remain a reminder of how a great idea can be undermined by poor engineering. Looking back, the Ranchero was like a concept car that somehow got released, said a collector who specializes in early Ford models. It was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, but just not ready for the real world. 10. DeSoto Firedome, 1952-1956. The DeSoto Firedome, produced between 1952 and 1956, stands as a tragic testament to the perils of overambitious engineering without a solid focus on safety and structural integrity. In an era where the American automotive industry was defined by bold experimentation, the Firedome was born from a desire to combine luxury with power. Chrysler's DeSoto division hoped to compete with the finest cars of the time by offering a sophisticated design and a potent Hemi V8 engine. The result was a car that, on paper, promised everything an American consumer could want: a stylish, high-performance vehicle. But in reality, it was a death trap waiting to happen. At its core, the Firedome featured the now iconic Hemi V8 engine, which, when it worked, offered a tremendous amount of raw power. The engine was part of DeSoto's big push to establish itself as a top-tier luxury brand, offering performance that rivaled the likes of Cadillac and Lincoln. The engine could push the car forward at astonishing speeds, particularly for its time, and it was more than capable of outrunning the competition. But despite its impressive powertrain, the rest of the car was not built to handle such performance. The car's suspension system, designed to maintain a comfortable ride, was woefully inadequate when put to the test under the power of the Hemi V8. The car's weight, especially the rear-heavy design, exacerbated the issue, causing the Firedome to exhibit extreme body roll. On tight corners or high-speed maneuvers, the car would sway and tilt in ways that made it difficult, if not outright dangerous, to control. The heavy front end, with its massive engine and bodywork, contributed to a lack of balance, leading to the car feeling unstable, particularly at higher speeds. The suspension's inability to manage the car's power made driving the Firedome a stressful experience, as the car constantly threatened to lose control. But the most dangerous flaw, one that would ultimately define the car's disastrous reputation, was its braking system. The Firedome was equipped with standard drum brakes, a common feature in many cars of the era. However, the sheer weight of the car and the sheer power of the engine placed an immense strain on these brakes. Despite their initial effectiveness, they quickly overheated during continuous or hard braking, often leading to brake fade. This meant that under demanding conditions, such as panic stops or downhill driving, the Firedome's brakes would lose their ability to stop the car altogether, rendering the vehicle dangerously unmanageable in emergency situations. Many drivers reported that they had to pump the brakes or apply extra force just to slow down, let alone come to a full stop. But this was just one issue in a chain of fatal weaknesses. Structurally, the Firedome was an even greater liability. Despite its luxury aspirations, the car lacked the crashworthiness that would later become standard in safer vehicles. The frame wells were weak and inconsistent, prone to failure during a collision. In a high-impact crash, the frame could buckle, causing severe internal damage to the occupants. The car's roof lacked the reinforcement needed to withstand a rollover accident. In such crashes, the roof was more likely to collapse entirely, a terrifying prospect for anyone inside the vehicle. The most notorious safety flaw of the Dotto fire dome, however, was the rear axle. In some crashes, particularly rear-end collisions, the rear axle would shear off completely. Once separated from the rest of the car, the axle would often be propelled forward into the cabin with terrifying force, potentially impaling passengers or causing catastrophic injury. "We towed one after a crash," recalled a mechanic who worked on several fire domes. "The axle was in the back seat. The sheer violence with which the axle could be dislodged from the car meant that the interior of the gear was a deadly place to be in a collision." The idea of an axle traveling into the cabin, effectively becoming a missile, was not just a nightmare. It was a reality that some unfortunate drivers and passengers faced firsthand. While the Dotto fire dome might have been a symbol of style and power, it was ultimately a car built for a different time, a time when speed and appearance took precedence over safety. Its V8 engine, powerful as it was coupled with engineering that was ill-suited for handling such power. And its luxurious features, including the elaborate chrome detailing and sleek design, belied the car's fundamental lack of concern for occupant protection. It became a mechanical and structural disaster waiting to happen. A former owner of a fire dome, reflecting on his experience, put it bluntly: "It was like owning a time bomb wrapped in chrome. When it worked, it was a dream. Fast, smooth, and beautiful. But when it failed, it was a nightmare that could kill you." 11. Oldsmobile N. The Oldsmobile 98, produced between 1949 and 1953, was a quintessential example of post-war American luxury, a rolling testament to the belief that comfort and style should be at the forefront of automobile design. At a time when the automobile was transitioning from wartime austerity to a new era of consumer indulgence, the 98 was a symbol of prestige, a spacious, plush sedan designed for the open road. With its sweeping lines, chrome accents, and luxurious interiors, it was a car that promised to deliver a first-class driving experience. But beneath its polished exterior lay a tragic flaw. When it came to crash safety, the 98 was woefully inadequate, making it one of the deadliest vehicles on the road during its era. The Oldsmobile 98, like many cars of its time, was engineered with a focus on power and luxury rather than safety. The car featured wide bench seats designed for comfort, offering a lounge-like experience for passengers. The interiors were adorned with chrome trim and plush upholstery, providing an atmosphere more akin to a living room than a car. But these comforts came at a steep price when it came to protection in the event of a crash. Perhaps the most glaring flaw of the 98 was the lack of basic safety features. This was an era before seatbelts were standard in most vehicles, and the Oldsmobile 98 was no exception. In a crash, passengers were often left unrestrained, vulnerable to violent impacts. The car's wide bench seats, while offering ample room and comfort, lacked any lateral support, meaning that in a side collision, passengers would simply be tossed about with little to hold them in place. The steering wheel was another deadly feature. Designed in the post-war period with a focus on aesthetics and ease of use, the steering wheel was positioned directly in front of the driver's chest. During a collision, this meant that the driver was at high risk of serious injury or death. If the car came to a sudden halt, the driver's chest would be directly impacted by the rigid, unyielding steering column, which could bend around the body and cause catastrophic damage. The lack of energy-absorbing materials, or crumple zones, meant that the steering wheel would act as a literal weapon in the event of an accident. The steering wheel bent around the driver, recalled a tragic incident reported by a former EMT. He didn't make it. For many drivers, the 98's dashboard and steering wheel were the final, deadly elements in a crash. But the horrors didn't end there. The Oldsmobile 98's doors were another significant safety concern. They were notoriously prone to flying open in the event of an accident, especially during side impacts or rollovers. In a violent crash, the doors would often fail to stay latched, leaving passengers at risk of being ejected from the vehicle. This lack of structural integrity meant that if the car rolled over or collided with another vehicle, the doors could spring open and unrestrained passengers could be thrown from the car, increasing the likelihood of fatal injuries. In addition to the doors, the car's interior was filled with sharp metal edges and hard chrome trim. The metal components, including the dashboard and window trim, were often positioned in ways that would become deadly projectiles in a collision. In many crashes, these sharp edges would slam into passengers, causing deep cuts, impalements, and often fatal injuries. The chrome trim, designed to add a touch of luxury, instead became a death sentence in the event of a crash. The Oldsmobile 98, in its quest to provide luxury and comfort, had completely neglected the fundamental aspects of passenger protection. While the car's power and styling may have impressed those who admired the post-war boom in automotive engineering, it was ultimately a ticking time bomb for its drivers and passengers. The lack of safety features such as seatbelts, airbags, and reinforced crash zones meant that any accident, no matter how minor, could result in catastrophic injuries or death. In a car designed to take people on long, smooth cruises, the reality of a crash could turn the luxury sedan into a nightmare. As one automotive historian noted, the Oldsmobile 98 was the kind of car you could lounge in during a Sunday drive, but in an accident, it was as dangerous as a kitchen appliance left running on full blast. The lack of attention to crash safety was part of a larger trend in the industry at the time, where the focus was on performance, luxury, and aesthetics, with little regard for what would happen in the event of a collision. For those who owned or drove the Oldsmobile 98 during its heyday, the lack of basic safety features was a tragic oversight. The absence of seatbelts combined with the dangerously positioned steering wheel and unreinforced doors created a deadly combination. 12. Plymouth Cranbrook, 1951 to 1953. The Plymouth Cranbrook, produced between 1951 and 1953, was a popular mid-tier sedan that epitomized the post-war American car market. Designed for the everyday family, it was reliable in many ways, with a simple yet effective engine and a comfortable, no-frills interior. It was often seen as a workhorse for families, small businesses, and even the police, providing a blend of ruggedness and affordability. However, beneath its modest exterior lay a series of mechanical shortcomings and durability issues that made the Cranbrook far more dangerous than it seemed at first glance. The Cranbrook's most troubling flaw stemmed from its front suspension. The bushings used in the suspension system were notoriously weak, and over time they would wear out rapidly. The result was a dangerous condition known as wheel shimmy, where the front wheels would begin to vibrate uncontrollably, creating a terrifying and unpredictable driving experience. This condition could strike at any speed, especially on highways or at higher speeds, where the effects of the shimmy would become magnified. Drivers often found themselves wrestling with the steering wheel, trying to regain control of a car that felt as if it had a mind of its own. In some cases, the shimmy could become so severe that it made driving the Cranbrook a nearly impossible task. This issue, combined with other handling problems, contributed to the Cranbrook's reputation as an unstable vehicle that was difficult to drive, especially for those unprepared for its quirks. But even more dangerously, the Plymouth Cranbrook had serious issues with its fuel tank. The tank was mounted beneath the car, and the straps that held it in place were made of subpar materials that were prone to rusting. Over time, the rusting weakened the straps to the point where they could no longer securely hold the tank in place. In some extreme cases, the tank would drop from its mounting, hanging by a single bolt, or becoming completely detached from the vehicle. This was not just a minor inconvenience. It was a ticking time bomb. With the fuel tank dangling from the underside of the car, there was a significant risk of a fuel leak, and with a little friction, the inevitable result was a fire. The fuel tank, which could be dragging along the road or even scraping against the ground, was exposed to sparks, hot exhaust components, or even rough road surfaces. This scenario created a catastrophic fire risk, and in the event of an accident or even just an unfortunate stop, the situation could quickly become life-threatening. One Plymouth Cranbrook owner who had experienced this terrifying issue firsthand recalled, "I smelled cane burn, but pulled over and the tank was hanging by one bolt." This terrifying experience was not an isolated incident. Mechanics and owners alike reported frequent cases of the fuel tank rusting loose, sometimes causing fires, sometimes leaving owners stranded with a car that was literally on the verge of combustion. This issue went largely unnoticed at the time, but it became clear over the years that the Cranbrook's fuel system was both dangerously fragile and poorly designed. As if these issues weren't enough, The overall build quality of the Plymouth Cranbrook was not up to par with many of its competitors. While the car was mechanically simple, it lacked the attention to detail that would have made it a safe and reliable choice for families. The chassis was underdeveloped, and the suspension system, in addition to the aforementioned bushings, was often incapable of handling the car's weight properly. This resulted in a rough, unstable ride, especially over uneven terrain or when the car was loaded with passengers or cargo. The car's braking system, while functional, was often inadequate, especially considering the weight and design of the vehicle. Stopping distances were often longer than expected, especially on downhill grades or when the car was carrying a heavy load. In many ways, the Plymouth Cranbrook was a victim of poor quality control and cost-saving measures that, while making the car affordable for the masses, created a vehicle that was dangerously unreliable. What should have been a dependable, simple sedan for families became, in reality, a car full of hidden risks that could lead to serious injury or even death in the event of a failure. The combination of poor suspension, rust-prone fuel tank straps, and underdeveloped chassis design made the Cranbrook a car with serious flaws that could not be easily ignored. Today, the Plymouth Cranbrook is remembered as a relic of the early 1950s, a vehicle that, while offering affordability and simplicity, came with a dangerous set of design flaws that put its drivers and passengers at risk. What might have been a staple of post-war American automotive history instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of sacrificing durability and safety for cost-cutting measures.